We can't wait
Hiding her
much longer.
past as a
The
doctor,
pass will be blocked
the
by
Maylord or
sundown.
bride reveals the
Just a
truth to
few
the
more
frontier
minutes.
town
They'll be here.
amid an epidemic. Dust swirled around the wooden planks of the market square, and the air carried the scent of pine, smoke, and something more elusive, fear. Graymore had always been a town of whispers, where every shadow held a secret, and every stranger was measured by suspicion. Into this uneasy quiet arrived a carriage, its wheels clattering over the rough stone of the road. Inside sat a young woman, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a bonnet shading her face. Her eyes, dark and alert, watched the forest as if it held answers she had long sought. Her name was Ilara, though she had traveled far from cities where her past was known, leaving behind a life as a doctor, a life that could no longer be hers. The carriage slowed at the edge of the town. There, waiting in the sun-scorched square, stood a man whose presence seemed to command the very air around him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his eyes, dark as midnight, studied her with a mixture of scrutiny and something softer, harder to define. Silas, the landowner who had requested a Maylord or bride, stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. Ilara! His voice was calm, yet it carried the weight of authority. She nodded, stepping carefully from the carriage. Every motion was measured, graceful, but she felt the weight of the town's gaze upon her. Children paused in the streets, townsfolk peered cautiously from windows, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Silas offered his hand, and she took it, feeling a spark of something neither could name. He did not smile, but there was a softness in his gaze that unsettled her. She had long since learned that such looks were dangerous. They invited trust, and trust had brought her nothing but pain before. "Welcome to Graymore," he said, his voice low. "Your home will be ready by evening." The house he led her to was large and old, perched on the outskirts where the forest pressed close. Shadows clung to its corners, and the wooden beams creaked with age, as if whispering stories of the past. Ilara moved through it silently, taking in the rooms, the faded wallpaper, the faint smell of candle smoke and old wood. It was a house built to endure, much like its owner. As she unpacked her few belongings, a soft knock came at the door. Silas stood there, framed by the fading light. "The town," he began, hesitating. "They are uneasy. There has been sickness." Alara's heart skipped a beat. She had heard whispers in the wind, rumors from the towns along the way of a strange illness spreading like wildfire, leaving people weak, coughing, and frightened. She had hoped to avoid attention, to hide her skills until she felt safe. But it seemed the town had other plans. "I can help," she said softly, careful not to reveal too much. Her voice held authority, the kind that came from knowledge. Silas's brow furrowed, but he did not question her. He merely nodded, as if acknowledging the unspoken agreement that her knowledge was hers, but could not be ignored. That evening, the streets of Graymore were quieter than usual. Lanterns glowed in the windows, and the townsfolk moved like shadows, their faces pale and wary. Ilara walked among them, Silas's tall figure at her side. Whispers followed her, questioning, fearful, admiring. She kept her head low, her eyes focused, feeling the weight of every gaze. In the square, she saw a small boy clutching his mother's hand, coughing. The mother's eyes were rimmed with fear and her lips trembled. Ilara knelt beside them, careful to speak softly. "Where do you hurt?" she asked. The boy pointed to his chest, and she felt the shallow rise and fall of his breath. Her fingers brushed his forehead. It was hot. She examined him quickly, noting the signs, assessing without panic. Silas watched from a few steps away, his jaw tight. He had seen women of many kinds, but none who moved through fear and sickness with such calm. Something stirred in him, a mixture of respect and unease. Ilara adjusted her shawl and stood, offering the mother a reassuring smile. "He will be all right," she said. "Stay close and bring him to the house if he worsens. I will help." The mother nodded, tears in her eyes, and the crowd murmured among themselves. Ilara felt their suspicion, their awe, their need for hope. She understood their fear, for she carried fear of her own, a fear of being discovered, a fear that her past would return to claim her. Night fell and the wind rose, carrying with it the scent of the forest, the unseen and the unknown. Ilara sat by the window, her hands resting on her lap, and watched the shadows twist among the trees. Memories came unbidden, the city where she had been a healer, the life she had loved and lost, the betrayal that had forced her into exile. Each memory was a wound that throbbed beneath her calm exterior. A knock on the door pulled her from thought. Silas entered without waiting for an answer, holding a lantern that cast long shadows across the room. "Do you ever sleep?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. "I do," she said, meeting his gaze. "But sleep does not erase the past." He nodded as if he understood, and then the conversation faltered. Words were unnecessary. They both sensed the danger lurking beyond the walls, the sickness, the whispers, the forest, and the unspoken connection between them, fragile as it was, began to grow. The next morning, Ilara rose early. She stepped outside into the cold, mist-laden air, and the town seemed to hold its breath. The first signs of the epidemic were visible: a man coughing violently on the edge of the street, a woman sitting with a child, their faces pale and anxious. She clenched her hands, fighting the urge to rush to them all at once. Silas appeared beside her, his presence steadying. "You cannot save them all," he said. "I can try," she replied, her voice firm. "That is all anyone can do." He studied her, the sunlight catching the hard lines of his face. There was something in her resolve that both unnerved and captivated him. She was not merely a woman who had come to be a bride. She was a force, quiet but undeniable. As she moved through the town, assessing the sick and offering what aid she could, a strange feeling settled over her. The forest seemed to watch, its shadows moving just beyond vision, its silence pressing close. The townsfolk whispered of curses and old magic, of dark powers lingering where no one dared look. Ilara listened politely, neither confirming nor denying, but her mind was already turning, calculating remedies, anticipating symptoms, preparing for what was to come. By midday, a small crowd had gathered, some fearful, some hopeful. Their eyes lingered on her, searching for signs of her truth. She smiled faintly, offering reassurance, but her heart tightened. Secrets were heavy, heavier than she remembered, and the weight of them pressed down as she treated one child after another. Silas approached her again, his voice low. "They speak of you in whispers," he said. "Some call you a healer, some a witch." She met his eyes, unflinching. "Let them whisper. Fear is louder than reason, but it cannot last forever." He seemed to consider her words carefully. "And what of you?" he asked. "Do you fear them?" "For their judgment," she said. "No, I fear what happens if I cannot help them. That is my only fear." A shiver passed through him at the intensity of her gaze. There was bravery there, yes, but also a vulnerability, carefully hidden beneath layers of composure. He understood, in a way he did not want to, that she carried wounds deeper than the town could ever see. The day drew to a close, but the shadows did not lift. A young girl, fevered and trembling, was carried to her door by desperate parents. Ilara took her in without hesitation, her hands steady even as her heart ached. That night she sat by the fire, the girl resting safely beside her, and allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The town had begun to notice her, to rely on her, and the tension in the streets mirrored the tension in her chest. She was not safe here, not truly, but neither was she powerless. A soft rap at the window made her start. Outside, the forest loomed, dark and silent. A crow cawed somewhere in the distance, its sound sharp and mournful. The wind carried a warning, a whisper of what might come. Ilara pressed her fingers to the glass, feeling the cold seep into her skin. There was much she did not yet understand: the illness, the town, Silas. But she knew one thing clearly: to survive, she would have to confront both her past and the shadows that now reached for Graymore. And in the quiet darkness, as the town slept uneasily, Ilara understood that her arrival had already changed everything. The epidemic had begun, and with it, a story of fear, courage, and the fragile spark of trust that could grow into something far greater. The next morning, Graymore awoke to a thick fog that rolled down from the forest, wrapping the town in a cold, damp silence. The streets, once busy with the simple rhythm of frontier life, were now eerily still. Windows were shuttered, doors closed, and only the coughs of the sick punctuated the quiet. Alara rose before dawn, her movements careful and deliberate. She dressed quickly, tying her hair back and adjusting her shawl, and stepped outside into the mist. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, a scent both familiar and haunting. Her heart ached at the sight of the townspeople huddled in their homes, fearful and uncertain. She knew that hiding her skills any longer would no longer suffice. The sickness was spreading faster than she could have predicted, and every moment of hesitation might cost lives. But revealing the full truth of her past, her training, her experience, her knowledge of medicine, was a dangerous risk. Graymore had already begun to whisper, and she could feel suspicion lingering in every gaze. Alara's first stop was the market square. A small crowd had gathered, their faces pale and anxious. Silas was already there, standing apart from the group, his dark eyes scanning the scene as if he could see every fear, every thought. He noticed her approach and straightened, the faint crease of worry on his forehead deepening. "Do you need help?" he asked, stepping closer, his voice low but steady. "I can manage," she replied, though she knew she could not do it alone forever. Her hands moved instinctively, checking temperatures, noticing signs of fatigue and dehydration, assessing the sick with quiet precision. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, some stepping closer, some retreating. A man coughed violently near the fountain, clutching his chest. Alara moved quickly to his side, kneeling beside him. "Sir, can you speak to me?" she asked. The man wheezed, shaking his head, and she noted the high fever and shallow breathing. She applied a compress of cool water to his forehead, whispered reassurances, and instructed his wife to bring him to the small room Silas had prepared in the house. Silas observed silently, his expression unreadable. He was impressed by her calm in the face of fear, but a part of him bristled at the knowledge that he did not fully control the situation. The town's reliance on her skills threatened his authority, yet he could not deny that her presence brought a measure of hope. By midday, word of Alara's abilities had spread. Rumors began to swirl. Some said she was a gifted healer sent by fate. Others whispered she was a witch, hiding powers that could not be trusted. The townspeople's fear and hope collided in murmurs and sideways glances. Alara ignored them as best she could, focusing on the sick and the weary. Yet the longer she worked, the more she felt the weight of her secret pressing down. Every child she treated, every parent she reassured, reminded her of the life she had lost, the betrayal that had forced her to flee. She had once trusted people with her knowledge, and that trust had been shattered. Now she could only act, never reveal fully who she was. Silas approached her again in the afternoon. "You do too much," he said quietly. "They will rely on you completely, and then what happens if you leave?" Alara looked up at him, meeting his gaze. "I am not leaving," she said softly, "not while they need help." He nodded, though the crease between his brows deepened. There was a tension between them now, an unspoken recognition that they were alike in ways neither wanted to admit. Both carried burdens, both had faced betrayal, and both understood the fragile line between power and vulnerability. As she moved through the town, treating the sick and offering advice, Alara began to notice patterns. The illness was not random. It seemed to follow the paths of the streets closest to the forest. Children were the most vulnerable, the elderly weakened quickly, and fear spread faster than the disease itself. Her thoughts were interrupted by a young girl who collapsed near the edge of the market. Alara knelt beside her, checking her pulse, her breathing, her color. The girl's eyes fluttered open, filled with confusion and terror. "It's all right," Alara whispered. "I'm here. You will be safe." The child's mother pressed against her, tears streaking her dirt-stained face. "Please," she begged, "do not let her die." Alara's hands worked quickly, her mind racing through remedies she could improvise. She applied a compress, gave gentle instructions for rest, and whispered words meant to calm both mother and child. The fog hung heavy around them, thickening as if the forest itself were watching. Later that evening, Alara returned to the house, exhausted but determined. Silas awaited her, leaning against the doorway. "You cannot save them all," he said, echoing words he had spoken before. Alara shook her head, brushing back stray strands of hair. "I can try," she said firmly. "Trying is better than nothing." Silas's gaze softened for a moment, then darkened. "You carry too much alone," he said. "Why do you hide your past? Why not tell them who you truly are?" Her chest tightened. She had rehearsed answers in her mind, avoided the question, and yet here it was coming from him, quietly demanding honesty. "Because not everyone can understand," she said finally. "Not everyone would trust me if they knew. The past, it is dangerous." He did not press further, though he wanted to. The unspoken understanding between them was growing. He respected her, feared her power, and yet found himself drawn to her strength. That night, as she prepared remedies and brewed herbal teas, Alara's mind wandered to the town's whispers of curses and magic. She had always been practical, grounded in science, but the signs were difficult to ignore. Animals had fled the forest, strange lights flickered between the trees, and the sick often spoke of dreams that chilled them to the bone. A knock at the window startled her. Silas stood there, lantern in hand, his expression unreadable. "The forest," he said quietly. "It watches." Alara swallowed, feeling a shiver run down her spine. She had felt it too, the silent, knowing presence of something ancient and unseen. "I know," she whispered. He nodded and left, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The night was long and sleep refused her. She sat by the fire, the girl she had treated earlier sleeping soundly beside her, and thought of the life she had left behind. She had trusted people once and had been betrayed. Here in Graymore, she felt the same tension. Trust was necessary but dangerous. The following morning brought a bitter wind and heavier fog. The sickness had worsened overnight. More children were ill, more adults weak, and fear had begun to turn to panic. Alara worked tirelessly, moving from home to home, tending to the sick, instructing families, and using every skill she possessed to slow the disease. Silas accompanied her once again, helping carry supplies, offering quiet support but never overstepping. His presence was comforting, a reminder that she was not entirely alone, even if the town's suspicion weighed heavily on her. By midday, a group of townsfolk gathered, their eyes wary but desperate. One of the town elders stepped forward, his voice trembling. "They say you are a witch," he said, "that your skills are unnatural." Alara's hands stilled. She met his gaze evenly. "I am no witch," she said calmly. "I am a doctor. I know how to help your sick." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Fear and awe battled for dominance in their eyes. Silas stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "She speaks the truth," he said firmly. "If you wish to save your people, you will listen to her." The crowd hesitated, then slowly dispersed, though whispers followed her as she moved to tend to another home. The weight of her secret was still heavy, but for the first time she felt a spark of hope, hope that her skills could make a difference, and that perhaps trust could be earned, even in a town so wary. That evening, as the sun dipped below the forest line, casting long shadows across Graymore, Alara and Silas stood together at the edge of the market square. The fog swirled around them, and the distant trees seemed to shift in the dim light. "The sickness is growing," she said quietly, "but so is fear, and fear can be as dangerous as disease." Silas nodded, his dark eyes thoughtful. "We face it together," he said. "I will not leave you to carry this alone." A chill wind passed through the square, rustling the leaves of the trees and carrying with it an almost imperceptible whisper. Alara shivered, though not from cold. The forest watched, patient and silent, and she felt the first true stirrings of dread. Something was waiting, something old and powerful, and the sickness was only the beginning. As they returned to the house, a small child stumbled from the fog, coughing violently. Alara knelt beside him, her hands steady even as her heart ached. Silas watched silently, understanding that the coming days would test them both, testing courage, trust, and the fragile beginnings of something deeper between them. The night descended fully upon Graymore, and the shadows in the forest grew longer, darker. Alara knew the truth. The sickness was only part of the challenge. There were forces here older than the town, older than the people, and soon she and Silas would have to face them together. And in that heavy, quiet darkness, a single thought persisted in her mind. The past could not remain hidden forever, and neither could the secrets of the forest. The morning fog clung stubbornly to Graymore, twisting through the streets like silver smoke. The town had grown quiet, but the unease among the townsfolk had only deepened. The sickness continued to spread, and while Ilara's remedies eased the worst symptoms, it was clear that something beyond medicine had taken root in the town, something older, something dark. Ilara moved quickly through the streets, carrying bundles of herbs and small vials of medicine she had prepared. The air was thick with fear, and the townspeople gave her space as she passed, murmuring prayers or whispering rumors. Some called her a savior, others whispered that her arrival had brought the curse. She ignored the whispers, focusing on the task at hand, though every glance reminded her of the precarious position she was in. Silas followed her silently, his presence steady and unwavering. He carried a satchel of supplies and occasionally spoke softly to those who doubted her, reinforcing her instructions. The two moved like shadows together, a quiet team in a town on the edge of panic. At the edge of the square, a young boy lay trembling on a makeshift cot. Ilara knelt beside him, assessing his breathing, his pulse, the fever that had gripped his small body. She applied a cooling compress and spoke gently, her voice a balm. "You are strong," she said. "Breathe slowly. You are safe." The boy's mother watched, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I did not think anyone could help." Ilara's lips tightened in a faint, weary smile. She wanted to tell them everything. That she had trained in distant cities, that she had saved lives before, that she had been trusted with impossible tasks. But the fear of rejection held her tongue. People were quick to fear what they did not understand, and she could not risk losing the fragile trust she had begun to earn. By midday, a group of townsfolk approached her cautiously, led by an elder named Marwick, whose face was lined with worry and determination. "Child," Marwick began, speaking to Ilara with a tremor in his voice, "we do not understand this sickness. Some say it comes from the forest, from curses that were laid long ago. Can you save us truly?" Ilara straightened, the weight of her gaze steady upon him. "I can help," she said. "I have knowledge that may save your children, your families, and your town, but fear and hesitation will only make it worse. You must trust me to guide you." Murmurs spread through the crowd, some nodding, some frowning, but they did not move closer. Ilara knew their fear. It mirrored her own fear of exposure, of the past she had left behind. Silas stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. "She is speaking the truth," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Do not let fear blind you. We face this together." The crowd hesitated, then slowly dispersed, leaving Ilara and Silas in the square. The tension between them was quiet but palpable. They understood each other in a way no one else could. Both had experienced betrayal, both carried burdens, and both recognized the weight of responsibility. That evening, as she returned to the house, Ilara could no longer ignore the whispers of her past. The city she had fled, the scandal that had forced her to leave, the people who had turned against her, they all seemed to follow her in shadow. Memories of failure and loss pressed against her, heavy and relentless. Silas was waiting by the window, his gaze fixed on the forest beyond. The trees seemed darker than before, their twisted limbs forming shapes in the fading light. "The forest does not sleep," he said quietly. "It watches." Alara turned, meeting his eyes. "I have felt it," she said. "Something is stirring there, something older than the town, older than anyone alive." He nodded as if confirming something he had long suspected. "We are not dealing with sickness alone," he said. "This is something more. A force that moves through Greymore, testing us." The words hung between them, unspoken fears pressing close. Alara's chest tightened. She had always trusted knowledge, logic, and skill. But here, in this town shadowed by forest and fear, logic alone was not enough. The next day a stranger arrived. He came with the fog, stepping lightly through the streets as though he belonged to the mist itself. His appearance stirred unease in the townsfolk. Eyes turned, whispers followed. He was tall, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce through the soul. Alara noticed him immediately. There was something familiar, something that tugged at memories she had tried to forget. He stopped before her, inclining his head in a gesture that was polite yet calculated. "Dr. Alara," he said, his voice smooth and controlled, "I hear you have been busy. The town speaks of your remarkable skill." Alara's heart skipped. This was the man from her past, the scandal, the betrayal, the one who had made her leave the life she had known. She forced her expression into calm neutrality. "I do what I can," she said softly. "Greymore needs help." He smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "Help, yes, but some things cannot be undone," he said. "The past always finds us, no matter how far we run." Alara's hands clenched at her sides, but she did not move. She could feel the weight of history pressing down, the threat of exposure. And yet she would not falter here, not now when so many depended on her. Silas appeared at her side, tall and protective. "You will leave," he said simply, his voice low but firm. The man's gaze flicked to Silas, assessing, calculating. "I am not here to fight," he said. "Only to remind her of what she left behind." Alara's pulse quickened. She took a deep breath, centering herself. "The past is behind me," she said firmly. "Greymore is where I am needed now. I will not be drawn back into old shadows." The stranger inclined his head, acknowledging her resolve, and then turned, leaving the town as quietly as he had arrived. But the tension lingered. Alara knew that the past would not leave her entirely, and that the town's reliance on her could be jeopardized if her true story was revealed. The sickness worsened that afternoon. More children were brought to her, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. Alara worked tirelessly, moving through homes, treating symptoms and offering comfort. Her hands were steady, her mind precise, yet exhaustion weighed heavily. Silas stayed close, carrying supplies, tending to those she instructed, and quietly supporting her. By evening, she had managed to stabilize several of the most critical cases. Yet, the forest loomed at the edge of the town, dark and foreboding, whispering promises of trials yet to come. Alara and Silas walked to the edge of the square, the last light of the sun fading behind the trees. "The sickness is one thing," she said quietly. "But whatever is in the forest, it is different. It tests us." Silas nodded, his gaze distant. "We will face it together," he said. "But you must tell me the truth. I cannot protect you if I do not know everything." Alara hesitated. Trust was difficult, fragile, and the past had taught her caution. But looking into his eyes, she saw no judgment, only concern and quiet strength. Slowly she began to speak, revealing the truth of her past, the city where she had trained, the betrayal that had forced her to flee, and the skills she had honed in secret. Silas listened silently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he stepped closer, placing a hand gently on her arm. "The past cannot harm you here," he said, "not while I stand with you." The relief that flooded her was tempered by the knowledge that the stranger's arrival had reminded her that the past was never truly gone. The town had begun to trust her, but suspicion and fear still lingered, ready to flare at the slightest misstep. That night Alara could not sleep. She sat by the fire, the soft glow illuminating her face, and thought of the forest. Shadows moved beyond the trees, shifting in the moonlight, whispering of things she could not yet understand. The sickness was not the only challenge. The forest itself seemed alive, watching, waiting, and testing those who dared to enter its depths. Silas joined her, his presence quiet but reassuring. He did not speak at first, simply sitting beside her and sharing the silence. Finally he said, "You have done more in these days than most could in a lifetime, but the forest, it is patient. It will not forgive mistakes lightly." Alara nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She had faced fear before, but the combination of sickness, whispers, and unseen forces pressed heavily upon her. Yet, for the first time, she felt that she was not alone. Silas's presence was a steady anchor, a reminder that courage was stronger when shared. As the town slept, a wind stirred in the forest, carrying with it a chill that seeped into the bones. Somewhere in the shadows, the sickness, the past, and the unseen forces of Greymore converged, hinting at trials yet to come. Alara's heart tightened. She had revealed her past to Silas, gained his trust, and begun to earn the town's fragile hope. But she knew that the storm was only beginning. The forest had secrets, the sickness had mysteries, and Greymore itself held stories that had waited centuries to be awakened. And in that quiet, tense night, Alara realized something she had not dared admit. The forest, the town, and Silas had changed her. She was no longer only a fugitive from her past. She was a healer, a protector, and perhaps, if she survived, something more than she had ever imagined. The first light of dawn crept slowly over Greymore, brushing the wooden rooftops with pale gold. The town stirred cautiously, as if it had survived the night only by a fragile thread. The forest beyond loomed dark and silent, its twisted branches clawing at the sky like ancient fingers. Alara stood at the edge of the town square, her hands folded over a basket of herbs, her eyes scanning the fog that still lingered. The sickness had claimed more lives overnight, though thanks to her remedies and tireless care, many had stabilized. Yet the shadow of the unknown force in the forest weighed heavily on her. She had faced illness and whispers, betrayal and fear, but the forest was a presence unlike anything she had encountered. It was patient, enduring, and impossibly old. Silas arrived silently at her side, carrying a bundle of blankets for the sick. His dark eyes were sharp, scanning the streets, the fog, and the townspeople. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low. Alara took a deep breath. "I have no choice," she said. "The sickness is only part of it. The forest, it watches us. We cannot ignore it any longer." Together, they moved toward the forest's edge, where twisted roots and dense mist hid the secrets within. The townspeople had begun to whisper, fearful yet hopeful. Some followed at a distance, while others stayed behind, trusting only in Alara's hands and Silas's protection. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became. Shadows stretched and shifted unnaturally, and the wind carried sounds that were almost voices, soft, distant, almost like a warning. Alara's heart raced, but she did not falter. Silas remained close, a silent strength at her side, and with him she felt a courage she had not known for years. At the heart of the forest, they came upon a clearing bathed in an eerie light. The fog twisted around them, and in the center lay an old stone circle, moss-covered and weathered by centuries. Here, the sickness and the whispers of curses seemed to converge. Alara knelt, placing her hands on the cold stones, feeling a pulse beneath them, as if the forest itself were alive, watching, testing. Silas watched her closely. "This is where it begins," he said quietly. "Whatever is responsible for the sickness, it starts here." Alara nodded. "We must confront it. The town's safety depends on it." She closed her eyes and drew a slow, steady breath. Her knowledge, her skill, and her courage were the tools she had now, but she understood that medicine alone could not face what lurked here. The forest demanded acknowledgement, respect, and understanding. A sudden rustling made them both tense. From the shadows stepped the stranger from her past, the man who had forced her exile. His presence was as precise and controlled as before, but there was a new intensity in his gaze. "Dr. Alara," he said softly, almost admiringly, "you have come far, but you cannot face this alone." Alara's jaw tightened. "I have never been alone," she said firmly. "And this town is under my protection." The stranger inclined his head. "Then let me help you. Together perhaps we can end this." Silas's eyes narrowed. "I do not trust you," he said, his voice low and firm. "You do not need to trust me," the stranger replied calmly. "You only need to recognize that the past cannot be ignored if you wish to save the present." Alara weighed their words carefully. Both had their strengths, but Silas was the anchor of the town, the protector, and now, the one she trusted most. She made her decision. "We proceed together," she said, "but the safety of the town comes first, everything else second." The stranger nodded, and together they formed a circle around the stone, placing their hands lightly on the mossy surface. Alara focused her mind, calling upon her knowledge of medicine, herbs, and the understanding she had gained of fear, disease, and human resilience. Silas concentrated on strength, protection, and willpower, his presence solid and unwavering. The stranger brought knowledge of the old ways, the whispered histories of curses and unseen forces. The forest seemed to respond, the fog swirling tighter, twisting, almost alive. Whispers became voices, voices became a chant that echoed through the trees, and the sickness that had spread through Graymore pulsed faintly in rhythm with it. Alara closed her eyes, drawing upon her inner strength, feeling every heartbeat of the town, the sick, and the forest itself. Hours seemed to pass. The air grew heavier, the mist thicker, and Alara felt herself falter, drained by the effort of channeling knowledge, courage, and willpower together. Silas placed his hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "Do not give up," he said simply. "We are stronger together." She opened her eyes and met his gaze. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel not just fear, but hope. The fear of the past, the sickness, the forest, they were formidable but not insurmountable. Together, they could face this. A sudden shift in the mist signaled a change. The whispers ceased, replaced by a heavy silence. The stones under their hands glowed faintly, and the pulse beneath them slowed, then steadied. Alara felt a warmth spread through her, a sign that the sickness and the shadow that had haunted the town were being quelled. The stranger stepped back, nodding. "It is done for now. But remember, Graymore will always be close to the old forces. You have only delayed what cannot be entirely destroyed." Alara nodded, understanding that the victory was significant, but vigilance would always be necessary. The forest had tested them, but they had stood firm, and the town would live because of their courage. When they returned to Graymore, the fog had begun to lift. The townspeople emerged cautiously, seeing the difference in the air. The children were brighter, their coughs lighter, and the adults who had been weak were steadier. Relief washed through the town like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Marwick the elder approached Alara, his face lined with awe and gratitude. "You have saved us," he said simply. "And more than that, you have given us hope." Alara smiled faintly, exhausted but fulfilled. "Hope is fragile," she said softly, "but it can grow if nurtured." Silas stepped beside her, his presence quiet but strong. "You have done more than anyone could ask," he said. "You have saved the town, and in doing so perhaps saved yourself as well." Her gaze met his, and for the first time she allowed herself to see what had been growing between them, the trust, the admiration, and the quiet stirrings of something deeper. She had carried fear and shame for so long, but here, at the edge of the town they had saved together, she felt the beginnings of peace. The stranger from her past had disappeared into the forest, leaving only the lessons of the old ways behind. He would not return, not unless the forest itself demanded it. And for now, Alara and Silas were free to focus on the town, the people, and the fragile hope they had restored. Over the following days, Graymore slowly healed. Children played again in the streets, laughter replaced murmurs, and the market square buzzed with cautious life. Alara continued her work, tending to the sick and teaching the townsfolk how to care for one another. Silas remained close, helping, supporting, and quietly sharing in the burden of leadership. One evening, as the sun set behind the forest, Alara and Silas stood together at the edge of the square. The wind carried the scent of pine and earth, and the forest beyond seemed calm, though its mysteries were not forgotten. "You have changed this town," Silas said quietly, "and in doing so you have changed me." Alara looked at him, her eyes soft but firm. "We have changed each other," she said, "and perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all, that courage, trust, and hope can grow, even in the darkest places." For the first time in many years, Alara felt a sense of belonging. Graymore was not just a place she had fled to. It was a town she had helped save, a home she had earned, and a place where she could finally confront the past without fear. Silas took her hand gently, a gesture of connection, trust, and quiet intimacy. "Whatever comes," he said, "we will face it together." Alara nodded, her heart steady and her mind calm. The past had taught her caution, the forest had tested her courage, and the sickness had demanded her skill. But she had endured, and in doing so, had found strength, purpose, and a bond that could withstand any challenge. As the last light of day faded and the stars began to shimmer above Graymore, a soft peace settled over the town. The forest stood silent and patient, but for now, the darkness had been held at bay. Alara looked up at the sky, feeling the weight of her journey and the promise of the future. She had faced the shadows of the past, the sickness that had threatened her new home, and the mysteries of the forest. And in doing so, she had discovered that courage, hope, and trust were stronger than fear, suspicion, and shadows. The town slept peacefully that night, and for the first time, Alara allowed herself to rest fully. The trials had not ended, but she had faced them, and she had done so not alone. With Silas at her side, the town safe, and the forest watching silently, she understood something profoundly simple. Redemption was not just surviving the past, but shaping a future where light and hope could thrive, even in the darkest places. And so, Graymore began its slow, steady healing, carried forward by the courage of one woman, the steadfastness of one man, and the quiet strength of a town that had learned to trust again. Alara had come seeking a new beginning, and she had found it, not just in the safety of Graymore, but in the bond she had forged with Silas, the people she had saved, and the knowledge that even the darkest shadows could be faced with courage and heart. The forest waited, silent and watchful, but for now the dawn belonged to Graymore, and to the woman who had dared to face her past and claim her place in the world.